I have been working in technology for 35 years. I started out working with a company on check sorters. And this is actually me on top of a wind turbine. So I worked for a company that did subcontract work. So this is something few people get to do. 300 feet straight climb up a ladder. So it's a great view. A little bit scary, but a great view. I've been an E member since 2003. When I had to deploy my first Citrix environment, having known nothing about Citrix. And since then, I've maintained a lab for nearly 20 years. One of the reasons I got into doing labs is the first company I worked for that I was trying to get certifications would pay for the certification test, but not the training. So I had to learn to train on my own. So when you build a lab, what does a lab need to look like? Well, it looks like anything you want it to look like. And I have some samples. I've reached out to several EE members for what their labs look like. This is my lab at home. This is a 42U rack. If I didn't have a basement to keep it in, it would probably cause a conflict with my wife. But it is a full 42U rack with servers, and I did wire a 30 amp circuit to be able to run it all because I got tired of tripping breakers in my basement. Here's another lab by an EE member, Wayne Barron. So I don't know how well y'all can see that with the light reflecting. It's kind of dark. I thought I had an impressive lab. He's got this massive lab that he also has battery backups for. So that is a rather impressive lab as well. This one is from EE user Tel2. I'm not sure who their actual name is or if they're here. But this is an ultra portable lab. He explained he has a lot of small space, and so he travels a lot. He made this lab as a highly portable lab. And these are a little bit out of order. This is a screenshot of Andy's lab. This is one of his, but he uses Raspberry Pis and stacks Raspberry Pis to run one of his labs. He's shown me some pictures of some other. So you can see you can make a lab as big or as small as you need. And you may say you don't have space for some of these larger ones. Well, something like this Pi will work just as easily. Intel NUCs, I don't know, that's all the rage. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're very small computers. They can be used for labs. They can be stacked together. Some come with one NIC, some come with two NICs. They can do wireless. Intel is actually, since I created these slides, they've announced they are going to discontinue them, but they've reached an agreement with Asus, who's going to start manufacturing them or continue the manufacturing of them. These cost, they're relatively inexpensive, anywhere from $150 up to $800, depending on the config. So they work really well for labs. You can run all kinds of nested stuff on them. So like I said before, I built my first lab back in 2000. The company I worked for, I was working on CCNA and MCSE and all that stuff. They would pay for the certifications, but would not pay for me to take any classes. So I was able to use resources at work to build labs. And it gave me a way to practice what I was trying to learn in the books. You can read in the books, but a lot of times, especially if you're taking a certification exam, unless you've actually done some of the processes, you're not going to understand it. And nowadays, some of the labs, some of the exams have a process where you have to actually go in and click and type and do this. Well, if you've just read that in a book, you may not exactly know how to do it. And so therefore, it's not as fresh on your mind, or you might make a mistake. And back then, virtualization didn't exist in the original lab, so I had to have a lot of hardware. And so that's one reason why you see a big rack there. Nowadays, everything's becoming so condensed, and you can virtualize things. So obtaining hardware. So you may say, well, buying hardware is expensive for a lab. Some employers let you take old equipment home, and that's how I did some of my first labs. I worked for smaller companies. They're like, yeah, we're done with this. You can take it home. I had a big server on wheels at one point in my house as one of my first labs. It made the room kind of hot. eBay. eBay is a good place. You can go on there and do searches and buy products or even components. to help do your lab. LinkedIn. So one of the most creative things I did is I reached out to my LinkedIn contacts a few years ago. And I said, hey, is anybody company getting rid of some computer hardware? If you're local to Charlotte, I'd be happy to come pick it up, take it off your hands. I had an account rep put me in contact with another Dell employee at the Dell office in Charlotte, and he gave me an entire VNX SAN array, which is about 8U, and a couple of recovery point servers. So the nice thing about the servers, even though I didn't need to use recovery point, I was able to then go on eBay and buy virtualization CPUs, and at least for like $100 upgrade the servers. And it gave me an entire stack for essentially free. And that's a good source. Friends giving away hardware. You can choose to purchase new. That's a rather expensive, unless you're doing a Raspberry Pi or an Intel NUC. If you're doing full servers, that can be kind of pricey. Or you can buy individual components off of other websites and just build the whole server yourself. Hypervisor software. Today it's real popular to run nested hypervisors. You can run a lot of VMs on one server, one piece of hardware with virtualization. VMware and ESX is a favorite of mine. Of course, I'm a vExpert. That runs a lot of my labs. KVM's free. I haven't really done much with KVM. It's a little more complicated. Hyper-V, if you're a big Microsoft shop or have Microsoft, you can do Hyper-V. It's built into Server OS a lot of times. You can use that as your hypervisor. Citrix Zen Server, this is one a lot of people don't know much about, but Citrix does make their own hypervisor. It's really good in a Citrix environment. I think they've kind of moved away from the free model in the newer versions, but the older 7 versions are still out there. Is it a free version as well? Oh, okay. So it's a really good product to use, especially if you're in a Citrix environment. VirtualBox is also free. You can do that as a hypervisor. Nutanix Acropolis Community Edition. That's a hypervisor not as many people are aware of. It does work, and you can run multiple VMs on it. It's a little more difficult to set up because it doesn't necessarily work well on older hardware in the way it's configured. Software licensing. So in a lab, one of your challenges may be how to license various softwares for running and doing labs. Microsoft products a lot of times have trials and evaluations. Now, one of the things I learned when I was in school is if you're doing any continuing education and you're enrolled in a university, a lot of times these universities will have agreements with Microsoft and other companies. As long as you're a student, you have access to free licensing. So while I was working on my bachelor's and my master's, I had all these Microsoft products. I got free licensing, and if you read the ELA, even once you graduate, you get to keep those license keys. So those are real handy for licensing labs. So a lot of my Microsoft products, I still use the same keys for my lab. VMware, you can run an ESX host for free. So you could have one host, you just don't get all the fancy vMotion and virtualization on that free host. But you can take part, like we were talking earlier, vExperts, which myself and Andy and others are members of. You get free licensing with that. You can also, if you become join vMug Advantage, you get free licensing, or you get VMware licensing included with that. And vendors like Cisco and Dell's, they have evaluation products for some of their stuff. So I can take a like Cisco UCS, which if you're not familiar with that, it's like a Blade Center. They have a virtualization component for labs that you can load up, and it looks like an entire Cisco UCS on a hypervisor. And you can sit there and do whatever you want to with it, just like you would at work, and create all kinds of test scenarios with that. I find that very helpful. How home labs help the community. So a lot of times I use my labs to create articles. Excuse me, I have a huge environment at work, but if I take screenshots from work, it's got server names, server IP addresses. Yeah, work would kind of frown on that. So that's not really a good idea. But with your own home labs, I don't care if my lab name is in the screenshots I do for content on EE. I don't care if IP addresses are in there. None of it's accessible from the internet. So it's really great for creating content and videos. I've also used it to troubleshoot posts on Experts Exchange. So I've seen somebody post a question. I try to recreate the scenario in my lab. If I successfully solve it, I can use that process to post to the question asker as the solution to their question. For an example, for Cisco, somebody was asking a question about UCS and the way the names were in the host, and I'd never actually seen that scenario before. And I went in on my lab and looked it up and found out exactly how to answer the question by testing it on my Cisco UCS lab on one of my hypervisors. So that's one way it can help the community. You can test products. So a lot of vendors will have a demo product or a test product, or you can run it in an evaluation mode, and you can test it on your lab and decide if it's something you want to use, or you can use it to write a review about or anything like that. How they can help your career. As I mentioned before, I've used them to do a lot of certification tests over the years. Even though where I work now, they'll pay for training, they'll pay for classes, they'll pay for the certification test. It's good to have stuff at home. Some of those classes only last a week, and then you're done. If you want to go back and run through the labs again, or test scenarios and study further for the exam, this is where your lab will come in handy. I've also used labs for testing upgrades at work. So, because a lot of organizations, they don't have a full-blown test environment. So, for example, many years ago, I was going to test upgrading the SQL database on a vCenter server where the SQL database still ran on Windows. So that's kind of risky. So I set up an entire scenario at home on my lab, ran through it, so I was more confident that it would work when I did it at work. And this gives you overall more skills and experience in terms of working with the equipment and working with all the different hypervisors. So it broadens your knowledge and broadens your skills. And so remember, you too can have your own home lab with a little effort and a little work. This was I put out a request for pictures for everybody's home lab, and this was one of the submissions. So I decided to throw it in, and Andy actually made the suggestion to make it the last slide. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Rodney.